The streets of Iran are burning once again. In cities across the nation, from the southern reaches of Fars province to the western hills of Kermanshah, demonstrations have erupted with a ferocity that has caught both the Iranian government and international observers off guard. What began as scattered protests over economic grievances has rapidly transformed into something far more significant, a nationwide expression of anger that security forces are now meeting with lethal force. Machine gun fire echoes through urban centers. Helicopters circle overhead. The internet flickers and dies in province after province as authorities desperately try to contain not just the protests themselves, but the very information about them reaching the outside world. This is not the first time Iran has witnessed mass demonstrations in recent years, but the speed and intensity with which these protests have spread suggests something deeper is stirring beneath the surface of Iranian society. To understand what is happening right now on the streets of Iran, we need to examine not just the immediate triggers, but the accumulated pressures that have brought millions of Iranians to this breaking point, willing to face armed security forces for a chance at change. The immediate spark that ignited these protests can be traced to Iran's catastrophic economic situation. Inflation has soared to 52%, a rate that has effectively destroyed the purchasing power of ordinary Iranian families. The national currency, the rial, has collapsed in value against foreign currencies, making imported goods prohibitively expensive and pushing even basic necessities beyond the reach of many citizens. For years, Iranians have watched their savings evaporate and their standard of living decline, but the recent acceleration of these economic problems has pushed public patience past its limits. The economic crisis Iran faces is not entirely of its own making, though government mismanagement has certainly played a role. International sanctions, particularly those reimposed and expanded by the United States over Iran's nuclear program and regional activities, have severely restricted Iran's ability to sell oil on international markets and access global financial systems. These sanctions have choked off vital revenue streams and made it difficult for Iran to import everything from medicine to industrial equipment. The Iranian government has long blamed sanctions for the country's economic woes, and there is substantial truth to this claim, but sanctions alone do not explain the full depth of the crisis. Corruption and economic mismanagement within Iran's political and economic elite have compounded the damage caused by external pressures. State-owned enterprises and entities controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps dominate key sectors of the Iranian economy, often operating with little transparency or accountability. Resources that should be invested in productive economic activity are instead siphoned off through networks of patronage and corruption. The gap between Iran's wealthy elite and its struggling middle and working classes has grown into a chasm, creating deep resentment that now finds expression in street protests. For ordinary Iranians, the economic statistics translate into daily struggles that have become unbearable. Families that once considered themselves middle class now find themselves choosing between food and medicine. Young people who have completed university degrees discover that their education offers no path to stable employment or a decent life. Small business owners watch helplessly as inflation destroys their margins and drives them toward bankruptcy. The social contract that once bound Iranian citizens to their government, the implicit promise that accepting political restrictions would at least deliver economic security and gradual improvement, has been shattered by years of decline. The protests that have now engulfed Iran began on Sunday in Tehran, but they quickly spread with remarkable speed to at least 18 provinces across the country. This geographic breadth is significant because it demonstrates that the anger driving these demonstrations is not confined to any single city or region, but represents a truly national phenomenon. From the capital to provincial cities, from urban centers to smaller towns, Iranians are taking to the streets with similar demands and facing similar responses from security forces. In Marvdasht, a city in Fars province in southern Iran, the situation has become particularly intense. Videos that have emerged despite internet restrictions show a disturbing escalation in the government's response. Machine guns are being fired at demonstrators as military helicopters circle overhead, a level of military force rarely seen in urban protest situations. The use of such weapons against largely unarmed civilian protesters represents a significant escalation and suggests that Iranian authorities have decided that restoring order is worth any cost in terms of casualties or international condemnation. Similar scenes are playing out in Hamadan province, where footage shows security forces opening fire on unarmed protesters without apparent provocation or warning. The videos are shaky and brief, captured on mobile phones by people risking their own safety to document what is happening, but they paint a consistent picture of security forces using lethal force against demonstrators. In Kermanshah province in western Iran, the pattern repeats, with government forces shooting at crowds of protesters who appear to be armed with nothing more than their voices and their anger. The exact death toll remains difficult to verify due to the information blackout imposed by Iranian authorities, but local media and human rights organizations report that several people have been killed in the violence. The true number is likely higher, as families may be afraid to report deaths and hospitals may be under pressure not to release accurate casualty figures. Each death adds fuel to the protests, creating a dangerous cycle where government violence provokes more demonstrations, which in turn provoke more violence. The government's response has not been limited to bullets and batons. Internet access has been partially cut across much of Iran, a tactic that authorities have used in previous protest waves to prevent protesters from coordinating their actions and to stop images and videos of the crackdowns from reaching the outside world. The internet shutdowns severely hinder communication, not just for protesters, but for ordinary Iranians trying to conduct business, stay in touch with family, or simply understand what is happening in their own country. This digital isolation is itself a form of collective punishment, cutting an entire nation off from the global information network in an attempt to maintain control. Despite the internet restrictions, videos and information continue to leak out through various means. Protesters and citizen journalists use VPNs and other tools to circumvent the blocks, risking arrest to ensure that the world sees what is happening inside Iran. International human rights organizations and media outlets work to verify these videos and reports, building a picture of the protests despite the Iranian government's best efforts to maintain a wall of silence. The cat and mouse game between protesters trying to share information and authorities trying to suppress it has become a crucial front in the broader struggle. The intensity of the protests has led to extraordinary scenes in some locations. In the city of Asna in Lorestan province, demonstrators stormed a police station in what appears to have been a spontaneous explosion of anger. The raid on the police station left 3 people dead and 17 injured, though it remains unclear how many of the casualties were protesters, police officers, or bystanders. The willingness of protesters to directly confront security forces and even attack government buildings represents a level of desperation and determination that goes beyond typical protest movements. Clashes between police and protesters have been reported across multiple provinces including Fars, Lorestan, Chaharmahal, and Bakhshiri. Each of these confrontations follows a similar pattern of crowds gathering to demonstrate against economic conditions and government policies, security forces attempting to disperse them with increasing levels of force, and protesters either fleeing or standing their ground and fighting back with whatever means they have available. The fact that these clashes are occurring simultaneously across such a wide geographic area stretches Iran's security apparatus thin and makes it difficult for authorities to concentrate their forces in any single location. These protests represent Iran's largest demonstrations in 3 years, since the movement that erupted in late 2022 following the death of Mahsa Amini. That earlier protest wave, sparked by the death of a 22-year-old woman while in the custody of Iran's morality police, grew into months of sustained demonstrations focused on women's rights, personal freedom, and opposition to the Islamic Republic's strict social controls. The Mahsa Amini protests were eventually suppressed through a combination of mass arrests, internet shutdowns, and violent crackdowns that left hundreds dead, but they demonstrated the depth of popular discontent with the Iranian government, particularly among young people and women. The current protests differ from the Mahsa Amini movement in their immediate trigger, focusing primarily on economic grievances rather than social restrictions, but they tap into the same underlying frustration with a government that many Iranians feel has failed them on multiple fronts. The protesters on the streets today include many of the same people who demonstrated 3 years ago, along with new participants driven to action by their deteriorating economic circumstances. There is a sense among many Iranians that the government learned nothing from the previous protest wave and has continued on the same failed path, making another explosion of popular anger inevitable. The Iranian government's response to these protests follows a playbook it has developed over years of confronting dissent. First comes the deployment of regular police forces to try to disperse crowds with tear gas, water cannons, and batons. When that proves insufficient, more heavily armed security forces, including units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij paramilitary volunteers, are brought in. As the protests persist and spread, the level of force escalates, moving from non-lethal methods to live ammunition, from crowd control to what begins to resemble urban warfare. Accompanying the physical crackdown is an information war. State media either ignores the protests entirely or portrays them as the work of foreign agents and terrorists seeking to destabilize Iran. Protesters are characterized as traitors manipulated by Iran's enemies, particularly the United States and Israel, rather than as ordinary citizens expressing legitimate grievances. This narrative serves multiple purposes for the government, allowing it to rally nationalist sentiment against external enemies, justify the use of violence as national defense rather than domestic repression, and delegitimize the protesters' demands by framing them as foreign-inspired rather than homegrown. The partial internet shutdown is a crucial element of this information control strategy. By limiting Iranians' ability to communicate with each other and with the outside world, the government hopes to prevent the protests from reaching the critical mass needed to threaten its hold on power. The strategy has worked in the past, most notably during protests in November 2019, when a nearly complete internet blackout allowed security forces to carry out a brutal crackdown largely hidden from international scrutiny. The current shutdowns are less complete, perhaps because the government has learned that total blackouts carry their own costs in terms of economic disruption and international condemnation, but they still significantly hamper the protesters' ability to organize and document events. International reactions to the protests have been swift, but largely limited to statements of concern and support for the protesters. The United States has been the most vocal in backing the demonstrations, with President Donald Trump issuing a social media post expressing support for the protesters. Trump's statement, which included the cryptic phrase, "We are armed, equipped with weapons, and ready to begin," sparked immediate controversy and confusion. The statement appears to suggest some form of American support or intervention, though Trump provided no elaboration on what he meant or what actions the United States might take. The Trump administration's position on Iran has been consistently hostile, viewing the Islamic Republic as a major threat to American interests and regional stability. Trump's support for the protesters fits within this broader antagonism, but his vague statement about being armed and ready has raised concerns among analysts who worry about the potential for miscalculation or unintended escalation. Some interpret Trump's words as simple rhetoric meant to show solidarity with the protesters and put psychological pressure on the Iranian government. Others worry that it could be hinting at more direct forms of American support for opposition forces inside Iran, which could dramatically escalate tensions between the two countries. For the Iranian government, Trump's statement serves as convenient evidence for their claim that the protests are foreign-inspired and backed. State media has highlighted Trump's comments as proof that the United States is behind the unrest, using his words to rally nationalist sentiment and portray the crackdown as defense against foreign interference. Whether Trump's statement actually provides material support to the protesters or merely gives propaganda ammunition to the Iranian government is an open question, but it certainly complicates the situation for demonstrators who must now contend with accusations that they are serving American interests. European governments have taken a more cautious approach, expressing concern about the violence and calling for restraint from Iranian security forces, while avoiding the kind of direct endorsement of the protests that has come from Washington. European nations have their own complex relationships with Iran, balancing concerns about human rights and regional stability with economic interests and the desire to preserve the Iran nuclear deal framework. Their statements tend to emphasize the need for dialogue and reform rather than openly supporting regime change, reflecting both diplomatic caution and a realistic assessment that external pressure is unlikely to fundamentally alter the Iranian government's approach to domestic dissent. Human rights organizations have been unequivocal in condemning the violence against protesters. Groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have called for international investigations into the killings and urged governments around the world to pressure Iran to respect its citizens' right to peaceful assembly and expression. These organizations face the difficult task of documenting abuses in real time while operating under the constraints of limited access to Iran and the information blackout imposed by authorities. They rely heavily on videos and testimony that make it out of Iran through various channels, working to verify and contextualize this information to build a record of what is happening. The protests are unfolding against a backdrop of broader regional tensions that add another layer of complexity and danger to the situation. Iran remains locked in confrontations with Israel, involved in conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, and engaged in a long-running Cold War with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. Any significant instability inside Iran could have ripple effects throughout the Middle East, potentially creating power vacuums that other actors might seek to exploit or triggering Iranian government decisions to escalate external conflicts as a way of rallying domestic support and distracting from internal problems. The role of Iran's security forces in these protests deserves closer examination. The Islamic Republic has developed multiple overlapping security organizations precisely to prevent the kind of unified opposition that could threaten the regime. Regular police handle routine law enforcement. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps serves as a parallel military structure, loyal to the supreme leader rather than to the state as an abstract concept. The Basij, a volunteer paramilitary organization, can mobilize large numbers of loyalists to counter protest or support crackdowns. Intelligence services monitor potential dissidents and opposition figures. This layered security apparatus makes it very difficult for protests to succeed, as there are always fresh forces to deploy and always the threat of escalation to more brutal methods. Yet the very existence of this extensive security structure also reveals the government's awareness of its own vulnerability. A government confident in its legitimacy and popular support would not need such elaborate mechanisms of control and repression. The resources devoted to domestic security could instead be invested in economic development or social services, but the Iranian government has made the calculation that maintaining its grip on power requires prioritizing control over prosperity. Every time security forces open fire on protesters, this calculation is tested, as the government risks pushing even more citizens from passive discontent to active opposition. For many protesters, especially young Iranians who have never known any government but the Islamic Republic, these demonstrations represent a fundamental challenge to the system rather than a call for reform within it. They are not asking for policy adjustments or personnel changes, but questioning the legitimacy of the entire political structure. Chants heard at some protests echo those from the Masa Amini movement, including direct challenges to the supreme leader and calls for an end to the Islamic Republic itself. This maximalist position makes negotiation or compromise difficult, setting up a zero-sum confrontation between protesters who want systemic change and a government determined to preserve its power at any cost. The economic dimension of these protests cannot be separated from their political character. Many Iranians see corruption, mismanagement, and the diversion of resources to regional military adventures and domestic security as fundamental features of the Islamic Republic rather than problems that could be fixed through reforms. They look at the wealth accumulated by political and religious elites, while ordinary families struggle to afford food, and see a system designed to benefit those with connections and power at the expense of everyone else. Addressing the economic grievances that sparked these protests would require not just policy changes, but a fundamental restructuring of how power and resources are distributed in Iranian society. The Iranian government faces a dilemma with no easy resolution. Continuing to use lethal force against protesters may succeed in clearing the streets in the short term, but deepens the alienation of large segments of the population, and virtually guarantees that protests will erupt again when the next trigger appears, making concessions to protesters' risks being seen as weakness and potentially encouraging more demands that the government cannot or will not meet. Meaningful economic reforms would require addressing structural problems, including corruption and the privileged position of entities like the Revolutionary Guard that are pillars of the regime's power. There is no clear path forward that preserves both the government's control and any hope of resolving the underlying grievances driving these protests. International sanctions remain a complicating factor that limits the Iranian government's options for addressing economic grievances. Even if Iranian leaders wanted to implement reforms or stimulus measures to relieve economic pressure on citizens, their ability to do so is constrained by the difficulty of accessing international financial systems and selling oil on global markets. This creates a situation where external pressure intended to change Iranian government behavior actually makes it harder for that government to address the domestic problems that are fueling instability. From the protesters' perspective, however, the government's tendency to blame all problems on sanctions, while corruption and mismanagement continue unabated, has worn thin. The courage required of protesters facing machine gun fire and military helicopters is difficult to overstate. These are not professional revolutionaries or armed militants, but ordinary people, students and shopkeepers, teachers and unemployed youth, who have concluded that the risks of speaking out are worth taking despite knowing full well what the government is capable of doing to dissidents. Some have seen friends arrested or killed in previous protest waves. All have grown up in a system where political opposition can result in imprisonment, torture, or execution. Yet they continue to take to the streets, documenting their actions and sharing their messages despite the danger. The role of women in these protests deserves particular attention. Iranian women have been at the forefront of opposition to the Islamic Republic for years, and they remain prominent in the current demonstrations despite facing particular risks of violence and harsh punishment. The memory of Mahsa Amini, whose death in custody of the morality police sparked the previous major protest wave, continues to resonate. Women protesters are challenging not just economic policies, but the entire structure of gender-based restrictions and discrimination that pervades Iranian society. Their presence in these protests represents both a continuation of the women's rights movement that surged after Mahsa Amini's death and a recognition that economic and political freedoms are inseparable from social and personal freedoms. As these protests continue, the question of what comes next looms large. History suggests that the Iranian government has both the will and the capacity to violently suppress these demonstrations, as it has done repeatedly over the past decades. The security forces will likely continue to use lethal force. More protesters will be killed or imprisoned. The internet will remain restricted, and eventually the combination of violence, fatigue, and fear will clear most people from the streets. But history also suggests that each round of protests and repression deepens the legitimacy crisis facing the Islamic Republic and brings closer the possibility of a tipping point where the government's control suddenly and unexpectedly collapses. The videos emerging from Iran, grainy footage of security forces firing on crowds, helicopters circling over cities, wounded protesters being carried away by their friends, serve as powerful testimony to both the brutality of the crackdown and the determination of those resisting it. These images circulate on social media despite government censorship, reaching Iranians who are isolated by internet shutdowns and international audiences who might otherwise remain unaware of what is happening. Each video represents not just documentation of events, but an act of resistance, someone risking their safety to ensure that these moments are recorded and remembered rather than occurring in darkness and silence. The international community's ability to influence events inside Iran is limited, constrained by the Islamic Republic's long-standing resistance to external pressure and the lack of diplomatic channels for engagement. Statements of support for protesters, while meaningful to those risking their lives on the streets, do not stop bullets or prevent arrests. Sanctions, already extensive, have demonstrably failed to change the Iranian government's fundamental approach to domestic opposition or regional policy. Direct intervention is neither politically feasible nor likely to produce positive outcomes given the Middle East's recent history of foreign military involvement. The Iranian people are largely on their own in this struggle, a reality that makes their courage all the more remarkable and their situation all the more precarious. Current developments show protests continuing across at least 18 provinces, with security forces maintaining their violent response, including the use of machine guns and military helicopters against demonstrators. Sources for this account include reports from local Iranian media, videos and testimony shared on social media platforms, and coverage from international news organizations and human rights groups monitoring the situation.